welcome on in. We're talking about the science behind the Secret of NIMH tonight. We're just starting off with right now chatting a little bit about psychological experiments that were done in the past before rules were put in place, because the Secret of NIMH is a big commentary on those kinds of experiments that were done without like IRB approval, meaning like a governing body of saying like how things should be run, as well as this like rat utopia that things are like. That's the basis of the entire movie, is this particular experiment. Yeah, so Danny, none of that was a thing back in the 30s. This was an experiment that everyone's like, oh, this is fine. This is why it's kind of hard to not separate the science and ethics components, that we need to chat about these things to make sure that bad stuff doesn't happen. Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Just setting the basis of why like we actually evolve in science is important.
I must tell you about NIMH. Look there.
Cool little plot point. NIMH stands for the National Institute of Mental Health, which is where one of the research scientists whose work this was based off of, an ethologist, not ecologist, an ethologist. An ethologist is primarily the study of animal behavior. His name was John B. Calhoun. He was doing a bunch of behavioral experiments at the National Institute of Mental Health. And so NIMH is a reference to the guy's workplace, and you'll soon see the whole movie is basically a reference to his real-life experiments that were ethically questionable at best.
A few pointers to polish my style. I told you you'd love flying.
I don't know how I let you talk me into this.
One thing we did point out when we were watching the movie, Chad, is how pretty the animation style was. And apparently the original people who wrote out the screenplay and everything pitched the movie to Disney, and Disney said no thank you. And so they actually did a rush job on this. I think they said it was like 31 months to get it done, and they got it done in a fraction of the price. So like the Black Cauldron, which came out around the same time, was about, I think they said $40 million to produce and draw and like animate, and this one was only $7 million. So just an interesting movie aside.
And rediscover the child in us all.
Okay, so for that trailer, it doesn't look like there's a lot of science in there, right? Basically, it just looks like there's a mouse and she's going on an adventure. She's trying to find a cure for her kid. Where the science actually comes in is she goes to like this rat kingdom. And how the rat kingdom is designed is based on the work of this particular ethologist. And I have to have his name, John B. Calhoun, who basically came up with an experiment to try to kind of create a rat utopia. So he was an ethologist, which is basically, it's an animal behavioralist, but not so much on the science front, but more like the psychology side of things. So more of a psychology experiment. So I thought first of all we'd start off with, I mean, there's a fair bit of ethical argumentation in this story. 5 psychological experiments that you couldn't do today, and one of them is what we're going to jump into then, and like really delve into what Calhoun did, what his results were interpreted as, and what kind of the goal was behind it. Yes, so he was a huge believer. Yes, so the whole experiment was guided by the idea of population control. So what he, like, this is going to be a short. This is going to be a teaser. So when we get to it, basically his goal was, I'm going to simulate a utopia with rats, where I'm going to give them unlimited food, unlimited water. There's not going to be any predator threats that can happen, and just see what happens. And the argument was that he presented was not just a societal collapse in the rats, but a biological collapse as well. They're led to be like huge levels of mutagenesis, to the point where if he pulled the rats out of this quote-unquote like devastated utopia at this point and put them into like a normal setting, they were so behaviorally scarred that they couldn't even mate anymore. They were like physiologically able to mate and reproduce, but they had been so socially perturbed that he wasn't able to. Yep, there were experiments on mice as well later, but in the 40s, his original experimentation was with rats. And then he did, like, it was in a barn setting. And then he had a couple of other alterations with mice and, like, trying to do the same thing. That was in the 60s. And then he termed the phrase behavioral sync. And it's a population control argument. It's arguing that you're having a collapse in certain behaviors as a function of having too many individuals there. Let's begin on the psychological experiments we can't do today.
But when researchers are working with human subjects, they have to balance getting answers with protecting their subjects.
And also, not just that, but the experimentation that was done in the 40s and the 60s by this guy, now you can, even though it's with mouse and rats, you can't do that anymore. Now we have strict rules for animal husbandry and animal welfare and taking those things into account. So you can't just loosey-goosey overcrowd a cage. There are in fact rules on how many mice can go into a cage, and like there's density control as well, like how many individuals per square foot there can be. You also can't cohabitate certain sexes of like too many sexes of certain mice or rats, because then they'll start to get aggressive towards each other. So there's all these rules and regulations now in place to prevent any of those experiments from happening that happened in the old days.
Volunteers. It's known as the Belmont Report. Basically, 3 key ethical principles to guide all human research. The first point is called respect for persons, and it means that subjects have to give informed consent. Anyone who participates in human research, including psychological research, needs to know the risks and benefits of the experiment before signing up. The second ethical principle is called beneficence, and it basically means that researchers should try not to have any negative impact on the well-being of the people who participate in their studies. Basically, do no harm. The final point, justice, involves making sure that subjects aren't exploited. Researchers should also make...
And this to us all sounds like pretty straightforward things, I would imagine, right, chat? But at the time, it certainly wasn't the standard case, right? There were tons of experiments that, you know, would make your hairs stand up if you found out they were being done on them.
In the year 1920, a psychologist named John Watson wanted to show that humans can be classically conditioned, like what happened to Pavlov's dogs.
And remember, we've talked about classical conditioning with ants and insects. That's where, you know, you associate a stimulus, like an odor or a taste, with either a positive or negative reward. And then the individual will start to learn, in the absence of the reward or the negative, you'll, like, just the odor, they'll have a certain reaction.
Proved anything. But then, of course, there were the ethical issues. Watson never reconditioned Albert to not be afraid anymore, so he was permanently affected by the experiment, and not in a good way. We also don't know if Albert's mother fully consented to the research.
Exactly, Skip. Not just the consent part, but also the long-term trauma, right? So these are why such experiments and trials need to be very well thought out and taken care of to not negatively impact the lives of their test subjects. And this will eventually be brought to animals as well. Not all animals, so it's weird of what's defined as what animals should be very closely cared for. So like it's mostly these like mammalian systems or birds, like something more advanced than like an insect.
The encouragement and criticism didn't seem to have much of an effect on the children's stutters, but the different kinds of feedback did have a huge impact on their self-esteem. The kids with speech issues who got positive feedback didn't lose their stutters, but
both, Maddie, right? The negative reinforcement is definitely going to destroy their like self-confidence and feeling, and then the positive reinforcement without actually helping anything is also, I feel like, it's damaging. So you and I, like all of us, we can agree here in chat, like this isn't right. But so, you know, back in the time when they were doing these experiments in the 30s and 40s, I was like, oh, this is fine. Again, another reason why we can't just like dissociate. Like, having that ethical discussion in the sciences is important.
The children also weren't debriefed after the project was over, and there was no real follow-up on how they may have been affected by the study long term. All of these things were later declared unethical by the Belmont Report. Experiments, of course, can...
And also, guys, like, just a poorly designed experiment, right? Like, even if you don't look into ethical components, like, no follow-ups to it, it's just like, here, loosey-goosey doing these things. It's just...
too. In 1961, a researcher at Yale University named Stanley Milgram was interested in the psychology of obedience. He decided to see how subjects would react when a researcher pushed them to do things that went against their morals. The study he came up with is now called the Milgram Experiment. The subject believed they were shocking the learner, but they were actually listening to an actor pretending to be in pain, complaining of chest pains, shouting, pounding on the wall, and eventually going silent.
This one's just like a crazy study in terms of like how far people will actually go in pressing that button.
Leaving your subjects feeling like they may have just killed someone doesn't protect their well-being, and they couldn't have gotten informed consent, since warning participants about the experiment would have changed how they reacted. And so in 1968, psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané at Columbia University came up with a way to learn more about why people might not act in a crisis, especially if there are others around. The subject was less likely to do something if they believed there were other people who could intervene instead. It's called the Bystander Effect. Understanding this response is important for investigating crimes and for protecting communities by teaching people to act during a crisis instead of assuming that someone else will do it. But like the Milgram experiment, there are ethical concerns about how this research might have affected the subjects after the study was over.
Exactly, Grimly. Like, it's an interesting thought experiment, but at the same time, like, you have to imagine there's long-term effects to that as well. Like, on the actual people who are involved in that study. Which is not good.
Another study turned out to be so damaging that it had to be ended early. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, a psychology professor at Stanford University, wanted to learn more about how being placed in different social roles affected the way people behaved. He decided to simulate a prison and cast volunteer subjects into the roles of guards and prisoners. 24 white male college students were...
I agree, Maddie. Most older psych studies have them. And in fact, a lot of them, even today, are still pretty flawed in terms of the science going into it because of how just the difficulty of doing controls for the kinds of studies that they're designing is less than ideal. So there's a lot of extra things that need to be looked out for. It's going to be a march to betterment in psych studies. Yeah, but a long, slow one, Maddie, because how do you act? Psych studies are very difficult. Anything with human subjects is very, very hard to interpret because there's so many background and environmental effects that are so difficult to account for, right? When socioeconomic status is going to influence the behavioral studies that you're trying to run, like...
In the end, Zimbardo concluded that the subjects had internalized their assigned roles. The prisoners became submissive while the guards became aggressive and abused their power over the prisoners. You could not do this study today. By acting as the superintendent, it was impossible for Zimbardo to stay impartial. That's a pretty big flaw in the study's design. He was invested in the outcome of the research. Zimbardo also allowed the guards to subject the prisoners to serious abuse and may have caused them real permanent harm. So again, that whole well-being thing was not really taken into consideration for this study. Like the rest of the studies on this list, the Stanford prison experiment would not be considered ethical these days. But psychology's sometimes dark past has helped scientists realize that they have a responsibility to protect the public and the subjects of their research studies, which is why ethical standards are an important part of modern research. If you want to help support this show, just go to patreon.com/scishow, and don't forget to go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe.
So, this is kind of laying the foundation of work that individuals are doing and questioning whether or not it's ethical, yes or no. It also leads to the question of what's ethical in animal studies too, which I think is important. The transition point, though, is our Secret of NIMH, and what is that based off of? Interestingly enough, the experiments we're about to talk about that were done on the rat populations, trying to identify a utopia, like a setting to like make a utopian society using rats, was then attempted to be replicated in humans many years later. The human trial was done in the 70s by a fellow named John Friedman. And what he did was he took together a bunch of high schoolers and crowded them into like a building, and he tried to measure their stress, discomfort, aggression, competitiveness, and general unpleasantness. And he found that he saw no negative effects of being overcrowded, which was a very strange kind of experimental setup. It didn't really make much sense in terms of results, but it's another one of those experiments that you can't do today. You can't just get a bunch of high school students and stuff them into like a room and measure like if they're sad or not, and like how much stress you're causing them because of the ethical concerns of like actual long-term stress that could happen on the people. But let's actually get into what that experiment was. And there is a neat little documentary from the National Library of Medicine that kind of goes over this like in very detail. We'll see if we want to get to it tonight. But this is the actual research scientist, John B. Calhoun, who was responsible for it.
Thanks for watching SciAntsMedia, and be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help our channel grow and support our science outreach and education goals. We can be found on Twitch most days of the week, and be sure to join us here for our next video. Thanks again, and stay curious, everyone.